Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for getting up early with another time change. We're very pleased to welcome one of your fellow guests for Communications at Sea, Signals, Codes, and Flags. Please welcome Tom Anderson.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I need to make an introductory comment. I have a large collection of these maritime talks, and my main goal is to educate people about the maritime environment and what I think is the increasing importance of the maritime environment in the future of the world. I'm especially interested in talking to young people about the wonderful career opportunities that exist in the maritime field. I have a talk just about that, and I have over 200 career choices that young people can make. So if you know of young folks that are looking around for something to do, there's a wonderful set of opportunities for them, and there's going to be a very rich environment in the next few years as we start using the sea for many more things than we do now. But today we're just going to talk about communication at sea. It's a fascinating world. I'll give you some vignettes and interesting stories. It's more a collection of things than a didactic, formal, logical presentation. These are the different career opportunities I talk to kids about, and I'm really excited to tell them about the things they can do at sea. Many of them choose careers in shore facilities. I know a young lady now is considering being a maritime lawyer, Sue, so she's following in your footsteps. And a lot of young people are very interested in the oceans. I don't have to tell you folks how important it is because you're all here. You wouldn't be here if you weren't interested in the sea. But just a very brief introduction to communication at sea before we get into some of the more interesting aspects. Probably the first time anybody communicated between ships, they used various hand signals, which were easy to be misunderstood and not very representative. That quickly graduated into something else. Sails on ships very often were colored, and colored sails meant different things. They communicated something about the ship, its cargo, its origin, its destination, or its intent. Audible signals are more of naval history than they are modern communication, and we'll talk very briefly about one of those. But eventually people decided they needed to have more complex forms of communication and developed codes. I know Ted's an expert in coding theory, but we'll just talk about three simple ones: the semaphore, Morse code. And I want to spend some time talking about these beautiful colored flags you see around ship and what they mean. And there's a complete language that they convey, and you can read that language if you walk around the docks and look at the different flags that ships are flying. And radio and voice communication really revolutionized communication at sea, but they also created a host of very, very serious problems. And we'll talk about how the maritime industry responded to that and the solutions to those problems. And I want to conclude by talking about national ensigns. You can think of these as country flags. Country flags communicate a lot of information, not just about the country, but something about the intent of a ship or her captain. We'll start off with a bosun's pipe. This is actually a whistle, but historically it's called a pipe. It's a copper tube with a little ball of brass on the end, and it produces a very shrill whistle. You've all heard this on TV or in the movies, and there's a reason for that. High-pitched sounds carry better on ships, especially noisy ships, and especially ships in a storm at sea or ships involved in combat. High-frequency noises are heard very well throughout the ship, and for that reason, these whistles had a historical use on warships, especially in the great age of sail. They're not really suitable for distant communication, and the only time we use them now is in ceremonial purposes. Here's an iconic image of a second-class petty officer in the United States Navy who is piping aboard a ceremony, probably a change of command ceremony. I should add that these bosun's pipes or bosun's whistles have provided us a very colorful language as well. For example, the last signal at night on the bosun's pipe was a signal to turn off the lights, go to bed, and be quiet. And we still have in our language, pipe down. And that's where pipe down came from, the bosun's whistle saying, okay, everybody be quiet and go to bed. The first real code that was developed at sea was the semaphore code, the use of colorful flags. These are visual signals. Sometimes people used handheld signals of other types, ping pong paddles, traffic cones on flashlights, even their bare hands. And the basic idea behind the semaphore code is that each flag position represents a different letter, and these can be used to communicate really very complex messages across long distance. They do require a line of sight. They're not helpful in bad weather or if there's some kind of intervening obstruction between sender and receiver. They are useful in noisy environments, and that's why they became useful at sea. They never really caught on because of some other inventions that superseded them, but they do have an interesting culture, and I want to talk a bit about the culture of semaphore flags. This is a semaphore alphabet. You can see different flag positions, and they have different uses. Authors of children's books are just fascinated with semaphore flags. You can't read a child's book without children discovering semaphore, giving people different signals. When I was a Boy Scout, we used to think it was fun to signal across rivers, or if you lived in a city, from the top of skyscrapers, communicating with the signal flags. These are still used in some beaches by beach guards, where the towers are typically 150 yards or more apart, and the lifeguards can communicate very easily by handheld signals. Sometimes they're still used today by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Canada when they don't want to use radio because their communications might be intercepted. The most common use today is something you wouldn't think of: trains. Trains have semaphore flags set along the tracks, and this is a complete set of communication symbols known only to railroad operators, but you see the semaphore flags there. The semaphore has penetrated our culture in many ways. And I'm not a good trivia player, but I like inventing trivia questions. So I'm going to give you several questions this morning. And as far as I know, these are all original with me. There's no copyright, so you can take them home and try them out on your friends. The first one involves something from my past. When I was in my training, I had the misfortune to study under some of the men and women who made the most dangerous things the world has ever known. My professors delighted in coming to class and gleefully describing to us their latest idea for making a weapon that could kill 10 million people in half a second. I thought then, as I do now, that is sheer madness. A lot of people across the world agreed with me, and a great social movement arose known as the nuclear disarmament movement. And the leaders of this movement said, we need to have a logo to define our movement. And they turned to semaphore flags, and they said, we're the nuclear disarmament movement, so let's choose semaphore flags ND for nuclear disarmament. And they decided they would design a logo around these flags. They chose the two positions, and they said, let's leave off the color. That's extraneous. That's an aesthetic detail. Let's just do the stick figures, and let's superimpose those two on each other and draw a circle around it. And this is what they came up with. If you ever wondered how that symbol defined a social movement and a generation, this is it. And I bet very few of you trivia playing friends back home have any idea what the answer to that question is. Just a useless bit of history. Another cultural, more amusing story involved the Beatles, who came out with a record called Help, H-E-L-P, and you see them on the front making semaphore positions. There's something really wrong with this. That's not help. This is a semaphore positions for help. What happened? Well, according to John and Ringo, who later gave an interview about this, when they showed up for the photo shoot, the photographer said, I'm not doing that. If you want me to take your picture, you'll do it the way I want to. And this is where he positioned them, and that's what finally ended up on the album, and it spells N-U-J-V, which as far as I know is complete gibberish. Another story from the cultural penetration of semaphore. They never caught on as a military tool. Napoleon was fascinated by it. He once sent a signal over 700 miles from Rome to Paris in less than 4 hours. That was a phenomenal achievement back then. Of course, it's completely overtaken by modern communication. Another code that you've all heard of is Morse code. It uses a sequence of dots and dashes to uniquely represent a letter. Somebody who's good at this can send a message almost as fast as I'm talking. It's really amazing how good a code this was. Most of us are only familiar with the SOS. S is dot, dot, dot. O is dash, dash, dash. S is dot, dot, dot. But Morse code was used very successfully, at least during the Second World War, and being able to send and receive code was a valuable skill that a young person could really learn very easily and be very useful on ships. This is an iconic picture of a Navy signalman flashing his lights. They also used for a while the device on the left called a heliograph. It used the sunlight reflection, and the signal was sent by covering and uncovering the reflected light from the sun. The problem is that Morse code in its initial stages required an unobstructed line of sight. If the weather were bad or there were other ships around, it might have been hard to communicate this way. Invention of the radio did allow Morse code to be transmitted over long distances, and various ships not even nearby could pick up those communications. And in this case, then secret messages had to be devised to keep the enemy from picking them up. And that's not coding theory, as Ted, who's a communication expert, will tell you. That's encrypted messages, totally different from coding. The first paradigm that came along, there are three things that superseded Morse code and semaphore. One of them is radio. This is truly a paradigm shift, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. This is one of my old ships. That's the USS Enterprise. I served as her senior medical officer for 2.5 years. She is steaming here alongside a French aircraft carrier, Charles de Gaulle. The second paradigm shift that occurred in nautical communications was the development of a phonetic alphabet. This was a designation of a word to go along with each letter. This wasn't casually invented. Linguistics experts spent some time developing this code. And this is just an example. The letter A would be represented by the word alpha, the letter Q, Quebec, the letter Z, Zulu. And you can use these words to spell out letter sequences that are otherwise poorly understood. And you hear this even today, a lot of things in the movies and on television about using the phonetic alphabet. Police officers use it, military officers use it. It has a great deal of utility. For example, if I tried to say Nautica over the radio, somebody might misunderstand that. But if I spelled out November Alpha, Uniform Tango, India, Charlie Alpha, nobody's going to misunderstand that. And that's the advantage of a phonetic alphabet. It is designed to facilitate the spoken communication and above all to minimize misunderstanding. Since I showed the French aircraft carrier, I need to give equal time to my friends from the UK. This is HMS Ark Royal alongside the USS Nimitz at the pier at the Naval Air Station in Oceania, Virginia. Here's the phonetic alphabet listed out, and I want to call your special attention to the numbers. Numbers are very often misunderstood. So look what the people have done who designed this language. Look at the number 3. You don't say 3, you say tree, tree. Or the number 4 has suddenly acquired, magically, a new syllable. It's not 4, it's 4. And 5 and 9 are very commonly misunderstood, but not when you say 5 or niner. And so the phonetic alphabet was a true evolution in communication in the maritime environment. I won't call this a paradigm shift because it evolved over really a couple of centuries. But this is the colorful signal flags you see today, and these are known as the International Maritime Signal Flags. They're very carefully designed and developed over a long time so that they cannot possibly be confused with each other. To complete this set is a colorful set of maritime pennants. Pennants are long, skinny flags with a short end, and they're used to represent numbers, punctuation, and many other things. And here they are together, and this forms the basis for my next trivia question for you. Something is missing from here. What is missing is a color. You see black, white, red, yellow, blue. What other primary color is missing? Green is missing. Do you know why? It's because most sailors are men. Now, what in the world does a sailor's gender have to do with the color of a signal flag? Exactly, color blindness. Most men are colorblind, and by far the most common form of color blindness, is the inability to distinguish between red and green. So the people who designed this code left out green for a specific reason. Otherwise, it might be easy for some sailors to misunderstand a visual signal. So it's a great trivia question to try on your nautical friends. Most people back home in your power squadrons have no idea why green is not represented in the signal flags. Well, the set of international flags we use now was actually established in 1855. It's been over 150 years since we've started using the standardized system. It's still in use and still working, so there must be something pretty good about it. And ships still communicate to this day with these flags. I saw some communications in Sri Lanka a couple of days ago. I'll show you one of them. And if you know much about signal flags, you can read the communications that ships use all around the harbor to indicate various things about their status or their relationship to each other. These signal flags are recognized by all ships and sailors, regardless of their nationality, and most importantly, regardless of the language. This is a language-independent communication. If somebody speaks Chinese and I don't, we can still communicate with signal flags without either one of us knowing the other's language. Merchant vessels used the standard international code of symbols, and of course Nautica being a merchant vessel, that is what we use here. Sometimes warships and military vessels will employ additional signal flags. You may wonder why I make a distinction between military vessels and warships. There is a difference, and I'll show you a great example of that a little bit later. Messages using signal flags are sent by hoisting a combination of flags known as a signal by flag hoist or a flag hoist signal. And there are three basic ways that we can communicate with signal flags. You could use them simply to spell out a message. This is pretty crude but effective. It's hard to misunderstand that communication. Each letter is represented by a flag and everybody knows what it means. It's easier if each flag conveys a specific meaning. One flag can be run up the yardarm and tell everybody around what that flag means. The I flag, India, is a symbol for a captain to say, I'm turning to port. In other words, my ship is going to make a left-hand turn. The signal flag Oscar would be flown by a ship who lost a man overboard, and that's the meaning of that symbol. I have to stop and tell you an amusing anecdote. On aircraft carriers, the man who's responsible for moving planes around the flight deck, it's a very complex process. It's called the flight director. One day our flight director got too close to the back of an F-14 and the jet exhaust blew him all the way across the flight deck and off the side. And as he fell toward the water, he keyed his microphone on his belt and said, "Man overboard, man overboard." That is presence of mind. He was picked up and back on the flight deck at work in less than 10 minutes, completely unhurt but soaking wet. Another flag hoist signal is kilo. If we're passing a ship and we want to say, let's exchange messages, how do you say, I want to talk to you in 20 languages simultaneously? You raise the kilo flag. Kilo means let's communicate with each other. A third way to use nautical flags in signaling is to have special coded sequences that carry a complete message. I don't mean to imply these are secret. They're well known and published in books, but a sequence can represent an entire message. I spent some time on the USS Mount Whitney, and we always flew these 4 flags from the yardarm. November, Oscar, Golf, Bravo, which is the identification for USS Mount Whitney. If we sailed into a harbor, somebody would look up and say, oh yeah, that's the Mount Whitney. This one I'm particularly fond of. I went to work many thousands of times under this flag. Charlie Golf 1. Anybody know what Charlie Golf 1 means? This is the international code for we are standing by to assist. This is flown on every U.S. Navy hospital in the entire world. It means we're here to help. If we were to respond to a vessel in distress, on arriving at the scene, our captain might very well raise this symbol, Charlie Golf 1. Another very common signal is Bravo Zulu. Bravo Zulu, the meaning is Congratulations and thank you for a job well done. You will hear people today say that. Thanks for a job well done. Bravo, Zulu. These are the primary ways by which communication with signal flags is accomplished. There's one more I think is interesting and instructive. I'll tell you about it. Perhaps many of you remember the 1965 movie, The Bedford Incident. It involved a meeting between a US warship and a Soviet nuclear submarine. And as the movie developed, it gradually became a more tense situation, culminating in both warships firing nuclear torpedoes at each other. And the movie ended with both ships being destroyed and everybody being killed. Can that really happen? Can warships at sea so